So good morning, everyone. I see that people are joining little by little. So welcome to this webinar from the CMCC series. This is a webinar introduced by the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. At the same time, it is a webinar which is promoted by an Horizon 2020 project, which is COACCH, co-designing the assessment of climate change costs. Good morning, everyone. I'm Francesco Bosello. I'm professor of economics at the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari, and I'm also the coordinator of the COACCH project. So let me first share the screen and give you a little bit of background of what we are going to see and talk today. Okay, so as I was saying, this CMCC webinar is also promoted by the COACCH project. The main focus of this Horizon 2020 project, which is going to end next November, is to improve our knowledge on climate change impact and costs. And what we are going to discuss about today refers to a very peculiar issue raised by climate change, which are tipping points. And in particular, we are going to discuss social economic tipping points, which are something different from the catastrophic events we are probably used to. Our speaker, unfortunately, we should have had three, but one of our colleagues is ill. I could not make it, but anyway, we have two excellent speakers, Predrag Ignashevich from the Institute for Environmental Studies, Free University Amsterdam, and Nina Knittel from the Wegener Center for Climate and Global Change in Graz University, Austria. Before giving the floor to our speakers, just let me briefly, for those who are not used or are new to this webinars series, introduce very briefly what CMCC, the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, is and does. CMCC is a multidisciplinary research center with the aim to improve the knowledge of all the multidimensional aspects of climate change. So the physical sciences, but also the social economic aspect related to this global phenomenon. It is an Italian research center, is a multi-division or multi-office research center, which is spread all over Italy. And here you see our offices where they are. And I'm talking from the Venice office currently. There are 11 research divisions, and you see the spread of the scientific fields that are covered. So multidisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity is at the base of CMCC research, going from hard sciences and physics to economics and risk assessment. We try to cover all the multidimensional aspect of climate change. So you see the 9 core topics that we are treating here at the Institute. In addition to research, we are also investing a lot in dissemination and outreach of the academic and scientific results, as we try to, let's say, bring the knowledge that we produce to the widest possible audience. And this webinar and the webinar series are one of the tools that we try to use to improve the spreading of all the knowledge and scientific outcomes that we are producing. A little bit of housekeeping rules. While the presenter are going to give their speech, you can raise questions using the Q&A section of Zoom. So we are going to give precedence to the questions that are written. I'm collecting them and will then redirect them to the speakers. But anyway, at the end of both presentation, and the webinar will last more or less 1 hour, so we have 15 to 20 minute presentation for each of the speakers. There will be the Q&A session. The written question will have some precedence, but also you are welcome to raise questions if you're not too shy, but please, you are very welcome to do this in person. Just raise your hand and we shall give you the floor to ask directly a question to the speakers. Just before asking the question, briefly introduce yourself, just name, surname, and what you're doing. Okay, and with that said, just my last duty is to recall that this webinar series is recorded, so be aware of that. You can find more information about the COACCH project visiting the COACCH website. You can see it on the screen, and of course many more information about CMCC are on the institutional website, www.cmcc.it. Let me just introduce the next webinar, that incredible to say, but will be as interesting as this one, and it will be on ocean and cryosphere, just to show the width and breadth of the topics that we are addressing usually with this series of webinars. So I think I spoke too much already. So without further ado, I'm just stopping the screen and give the floor to Predrag, which is our first speaker. Predrag, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, sorry, can everyone hear me? I think hopefully you can also see my screen. Yes. Well, hello everyone. My name is Predrag Ignjačević. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Environmental Questions, which is an institute dedicated to tackling questions of climate change and the environment at the Free Institute of Amsterdam. And I have to apologize in advance for any background noise, because I'm in a very small rural hotel in the mountains of Montenegro currently. So it's quite pleasant, but also, yeah, it's quite small. So just a warning in advance. So what I would like to talk to you about today is the time of emergence of economic impacts of climate change. And during my time as a PhD student at the Institute, I've mainly been working with a model that predicts or projects the impacts of climate change. And then we try to put some monetary value to these impacts. We try as good economists to say how much climate change is going to cost everybody. And we wanted to this time take a slightly different approach. We realized that maybe giving monetary values to these extreme consequences might not always be the best way to go about things. But we would also like to find a measure which would really focus specifically on these extreme events. So the moment when climate change really reaches a certain tipping point, when these consequences become really, really severe. And so that, let me see, does this work? Yes. So that's the focus of today's discussion. In particular, we're dealing with the so-called integrated assessment models of climate change. And if you're not familiar with these kinds of models, they're used very frequently to advise policymakers on how to tackle the questions of climate mitigation and climate adaptation. but very frequently we're using indeed some monetary estimate to tell people how severe climate change is going to be. But what if we ask the question, would climate change impacts be worse than the 2008 economic crisis, for example, or an oil crisis, or, for example, the global pandemic? If we have ways of monetizing these different impacts, we should be able to compare between them and say, at what point would climate change really be worse than, for example, what our economies have experienced in the past 50 years? So that is the challenge that we took on in our latest paper. And this is not really a completely new idea. Climate scientists have already used the concept of time of emergence to determine at which point, for example, the temperature change will exceed some historical bounds. I think now you'd be able to see the full screen, sorry. So you would, for example, ask yourself, at what is the date when the impacts of climate change in any particular area, for example, Germany, would exceed some very, very high percentile of the past economic shock? For example, the 2008 crisis would be considered a very severe event. So we would track the year in which our model projects climate impacts, and we'll be able to tell you, okay, this would, for example, happen in 2055 or maybe later. And all of this, of course, depends on the choice of the climate and the socio-economic model and data that we're using to feed our model. Yes. So what is our method of approach? So we're using a relatively novel integrated assessment model called ClimRisk. And what ClimRisk is very good at as a model is it's good at predicting damages at a very local scale. So whereas a lot of these models that try to estimate impacts of climate change work on a regional or even global scale, we're trying to make these impacts very local. So more specifically, this works on a 1/2 by 1/2 degree scale, or approximately 50 by 50 kilometers around the equator. And we're dealing with the time horizon of between year 2010 up to 2100, so the 21st century. And we can also use several different RCP scenarios, which are used in these models to tell us how temperature will evolve over the coming years. And that also sort of gives a signal of how big climate mitigation in place is. So all of these things enter our model, and we are then essentially projecting how big these impacts are on a very local scale. And all we're doing is comparing this to historical impacts. So essentially economic damages in the past, and how at what year would this essentially be exceeded. And we call this the time of emergence of economic impacts. What is also interesting about the ClimRisk model is that we can also take into account the urban heat island effect. And the urban heat island effect is a very specific phenomenon that occurs in urban areas where the local temperature in a city is expected to be much higher due to various factors such as the infrastructure, the traffic, and general population density that all contribute to a much faster evolution of climate change in cities. So given that our model is very local, we also can account for these local city effects. And our expectation is that in cities, this time of emergence would happen much quicker. So very, very highly populated cities with a lot of economic activity could be at risk already, potentially. So maybe to move on to some interesting results, we always tend to make these nice looking maps with a lot of dots, and more specifically, these very red areas indicate highly populated cities, in this case in Europe. And in this figure, what you're looking at is on the left, we have a very high mitigation scenario, the RCP 2.6 scenario, which would mean that we are abiding by the Paris Agreement. And on the right, we have a very fossil fuel driven development. So there are very contrasting extreme cases of climate mitigation policy. And we can see that that the time of emergence of impacts would occur in the coming century if nothing is done about climate change. And more importantly, this would happen much faster in the urban areas. So in Central and Western Europe, many cities could also already experience this effect around year 2040. But if we're looking at the RCP 2.6 scenario on the left, we see that barely any areas in Europe would experience the time emergence in the current century. And this also has to do with the fact that climate mitigation would mean that temperature change will at some point towards the end of the century really reduce. So we're not going to get any more severe damages. So the economic impacts would never be exceeded. The past impacts would never be exceeded. We can, of course, do these for other areas in the world as well. In this figure, you can see that India, which has a lot of economic activity and population density in the north, could even experience the time of emergence in the northern area, even with climate mitigation being as desired by the Paris Agreement. But if nothing is done, of course, we see that India is one of the most affected countries in Southeast Asia, and that many areas would again experience the time emergence of impacts in the first half of the century. It is also important to mention, I think I forgot to mention that this measure is very dependent on the local economic history. So when we're comparing these future impacts to the past impacts in a particular region, we're looking at what were the past shocks of that country. So, for example, if a country really had severe economic shocks in the past, I would take here the example of China, which had the Great Famine in the years 1960s, where quite a significant portion of the GDP or the gross domestic output was lost. That is quite a severe effect that climate change has to exceed. So therefore, you're seeing that with our measure, China does not appear to have a very high risk, but this is also just an artifact of our modeling approach. So the measure of time of emergence. And finally, for the US, we can see a very similar story to Europe. So under the RCP 2.6, we are essentially seeing no exceedance of the past economic shocks, very possibly due to the economic crisis of 2008, which affected the developed world significantly. And then on the right-hand side, of course, many areas would experience the time emergence by year 2080 or 2090. And of course, cities much earlier than that. And finally, we can also zoom into particularly cities in the world and in Europe. And we can sort of plot in a single figure the difference between different cities and also the time of emergence of exceeding particular shock thresholds. So, for example, as a policymaker, you may not be interested in the exceedance of the most severe past shock, such as the economic crisis, but maybe you're interested in at what point would climate change be as severe as some average median economic shock in the past. So we can really plot this for many different economic shocks. And as you can see, as these shocks become more severe, it is more difficult for climate change to exceed these shocks. So you're getting a very upward sloping figure. And at some point, if the shocks in the past are so severe, you would not realistically exceed these shocks in the current century with climate change. But this is just an example of a nice way to compare between different cities and also different shock thresholds. So maybe the main point to highlight here is that this model that we're using, ClimRisk, is very flexible in really comparing between different climate policies, different economic shocks, and also different geographic areas. So in that sense, it's a very flexible integrated assessment model. So maybe I can sort of conclude shortly what we've discussed. So we can see that unprecedented impacts of climate change could be experienced in many areas around Europe, particularly in cities. And the same goes for the US. And you can, of course, zoom on many different areas. And we can see that really climate mitigation does delay these risks significantly. And in many cases by several decades. So you can almost see this measure as the measure of time of emergence telling us what is really the time frame for potential adaptation. So how much time do we have before climate change becomes so severe that we're not sure what the implications of this would be. So those are the tipping points we're talking about frequently. And we can see that, of course, with the Paris Agreement, many areas in the world would never even exceed these past economic shocks, which is good news and something to obviously strive for. And this measure, like many other, most other research, also supports this claim. And again, to highlight, of course, that applying this climate mitigation, so really following the Paris Agreement and steering clear of the fossil fuel development would buy us time for climate adaptation should severe effects of climate change start happening more and more often as we proceed into the 21st century. So that is all from my side for the presentation. I'm really looking forward to the questions and a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Predrag. We have already some questions that we are collecting in the Q&A, but before answering them and addressing them directly, I would like to give the floor to Nina for her presentation, and then we are collecting all the questions and have I think an interactive Q&A session at the end. So anyway, very interesting, and I have also some ideas for the communication of results that I will share with you afterwards. So Nina, please, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward for your presentation now.
Okay, thank you. You should see my screen now.
Yes,
correct?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, and yeah. Great, so thank you very much. My name is Nina Knittel. I'm working at the Wegener Center for Climate and Global Change at the University of Graz, and I will present a piece of work that we have undertaken together with colleagues from the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Free University of Amsterdam. And it's about macroeconomic assessment of flood risk under different insurance market systems. And this has been motivated also by previous work in the COACCH project, where colleagues found that climate change can lead to socio-economic tipping points with respect to insurance markets in some EU regions. I will first give you some context. My slide, okay. So I will first give you some context, will then present you the research questions that we ask, very briefly the methodology, and then some hopefully interesting results and conclusion. So to the context, we speak about flood risk. So river and flood risk is expected to increase in many parts of the EU as a result of climate and socioeconomic change. So on the one hand, climate parameters that are relevant for flooding, such as precipitation or temperature, are expected to increase in frequency and intensity, increasing flood risk. But on the other hand, also socioeconomic change is a very important driver for flood risk, with increasing GDP and wealth, also increasing the exposed assets to flood risk, also with settlements in areas that are at risk from flooding. With respect to the relevance, flood risk is also among the most important impact types for European regions. This has been found by studies that undertook comprehensive impact assessments looking at different impact channels. So it's a relevant and increasing risk, and we have to think about how to handle this risk or how to deal with it. And effective adaptation besides the more classic, say, flood protection walls and dikes, includes also insurance. And insurance provides adequate financial compensation for individuals that experience flood damage. However, the design of insurance mechanisms varies significantly across EU countries, and this has implications for the insured parties, so the households, but also the insurance provider companies and also the public household who may need to step in case of insufficient coverage. So all these factors together put growing pressure on insurance markets with the potential need for reforms. So more recently, the discussion in the literature has moved towards the design of an insurance against natural hazards with a special focus on risk sharing possibilities. So the current flood insurance systems in EU countries can be broadly classified into these three classes, which we are also going to investigate later in the macroeconomic assessment. So the first class is a voluntary or a semi-voluntary system that has risk-based premiums, private reinsurance, and a voluntary uptake, or for the semi-voluntary system, uptake is required for a mortgage. So this is in place in the majority of EU countries at the moment, which means that there is premiums are rather high because they are fully risk reflective, and households can decide whether to insure against flood risk or not. So the uptake is also rather low. The second class of systems is the solidarity system, which is currently in place in France, Belgium, Spain, and Romania. And this has a mandatory uptake and no premium differentiation. So each household pays the same, no matter his individual or household level risk. So no matter where he lives, it's kind of a tax, so to say. And then third, there's the public-private partnership, currently only in place in the UK, which has a mandatory uptake, but premiums are only limitedly risk-based. So they are risk-reflective, but there is an upper limit to how large they can be. And there's a public reinsurer who covers the most extreme portion of risk. And Tessela et al., so our colleagues at the IBM, Institute for Environmental Studies, have shown in a partial equilibrium analysis, and I will also shortly introduce this model, that unaffordability of insurance becomes a significant problem in certain areas due to climate change, and that existing insurance markets can disappear in some areas due to the high prices and the low demand for coverage. And they also found that implementing policy adjustments, such as a higher degree of risk sharing, uptake requirements, or a public reinsurer can reduce these problems. So from the literature and also this partial equilibrium analysis, we find that some kind of risk sharing is superior to other mechanisms, and especially to the voluntary system. And we wanted to find out whether this holds also in a macroeconomic setting, so considering macroeconomic feedback effects. So the first research question is, what are the macroeconomic implications of flood risk? And we look into the future, into 2050, considering a broad set of socioeconomic and climate scenarios for different global climate models. Secondly, we want to see how these macroeconomic implications can be improved under policy changes, investigating different insurance market systems, and also recognizing the role of different actors. And finally, we also looked at which system yields the lowest overall costs for the EU. Okay, so as to the methodology, as I said, this is going to be brief. This gives you a conceptual overview of the model chain from emission scenarios to the macroeconomic analysis. So if we start from the left, we use data for a set of RCPs, so representative concentration pathways, different climate scenarios, together with different climate models that provide data on temperature, precipitation, potential evaporation, which are then used in a hydrological impact model called GLOFRIS, which then determines changes in flood risk that is used in the partial equilibrium model, the DeFi model, which I will talk about in a second, and also directly in the macroeconomic model, the COIN-int model, which I will also present. And we also consider different socioeconomic scenarios, so different potential developments of the economy. Sorry. So the dynamic integrated flood insurance model, the DeFi model, is composed of a flood risk model that determines flood risk for NUTS2 level regions, which are then used in an insurance sector model to calculate premiums depending on stylized insurance systems. So these three systems that you can see on the right-hand side, as I introduced earlier. And these premiums are then used in a consumer behavior model to determine in a first step whether insurance is affordable, so depending on an household income threshold. And second, if affordable, whether households take up insurance and adaptation measures will depend on expected utility maximization. And then the outcome of these insurance sector model and consumer behavior model are used in the macroeconomic model, which is a CGE model. And these parameters are premiums for private households, so the size of the premiums, reinsurance premiums, incentivized adaptation action by insurances to get lower premiums, and insurance market penetration rate together with the associated uncovered risk. So one slide on the macroeconomic model. It's a global CGE model, so a computable general equilibrium model, which implies zero profit conditions for all economic activities associated with a level for these activities. It also implies market clearance conditions for all commodities and factors associated with the price to these commodities and factors. And it also implies income expenditure balance for the representative agents. In our model, we depict the world economy as 26 regions with a focus on EU regions, and each consists of 20 sectors and 2 representative regional households. So we have a private and a public household. This figure shows the consistent flows, the closed system of flows in the CGE model, where on the left-hand side, we have the regional household, which is endowed with labor, capital, land resources, which it supplies to the domestic production. And domestically produced goods can be either exported or together with imports from other regions, they form the Armington aggregate, which is then supplied on the domestic market and can be either used as intermediate inputs in domestic production again, or as final demand for the regional household. So now we get to the results. And the first question was, what are the macroeconomic implications of flood risk in 2050 with the current insurance market system for each region? And we depict here the changes in GDP, private welfare, and public welfare as percentage difference from a baseline without flood risk in 2050. It says it for a worst case scenario. So considering this scenario combinations we have, this is the worst case, but it doesn't make a qualitative difference if we look at other scenario combinations. So on the left-hand side, this is the UK with the public-private partnership in place. Then we have France, Belgium, Spain, and Romania with the solidarity system. And then the other regions, I think the first are self-explanatory. And then the 5 last regions are aggregates of 2 or 3 countries, the Baltic states, Northern EU, Northeastern EU, Southeastern EU, and Southern EU. A note on welfare, this can be understood as change in consumption possibilities. So if you think of the public household and its consumption possibilities, we have to keep in mind that this is also very relevant for the private welfare, for private households, as public consumption is often used for the provision of public goods. The differences in the affectedness of the regions very much reflects the direct damages of flood risk in 2050. So flooding also depends very much on current adaptation standards and protection standards, which are lower in low-income households, low-income regions such as Romania or Poland, and also Southeastern EU, including Hungary and Bulgaria. And lower impacts in, for example, Netherlands or the UK. And then the difference between private and public welfare reflects how governments handle uncovered risk. So whether there is a high compensation rate, so whether governments issue compensation payments to affected households or not, or the private household has to cover damages itself. So for example, in Southeastern Asia, but also Poland and Italy, there's a high compensation rate for these uncovered risks. So governments pay compensation payments to households. In contrast, for example, the Netherlands or in the Baltic states, there are no such compensation payments, and the private household have to cover uncovered risk themselves. So then we wanted to know how these indicators change if we assume a different insurance market system. And as suggested by the literature and the partial equilibrium model, private voluntary systems are not the way to go. So we look into public-private partnerships and solidarity systems. So if we assume now public-private partnership or a solidarity system in all regions simultaneously, we see here the percentage point difference from the baseline insurance markets for all regions. And a positive value indicates an improvement over the initial system. So for the first 5 countries, there are no big differences as they had a PPP or solidarity system in place also in the baseline, except for an improvement of government welfare for those systems with the solidarity, for those regions with a solidarity system when they move to a public-private partnership, which is due to the reinsurance premium that is paid to the public household to cover this extreme portion of risk. For those regions that have a private voluntary system in the baseline, both a PPP and a solidarity system imply an improvement over the current systems. And whether the improvement is larger for the private welfare or the government welfare, again, depends on how the government handles compensation payments in the initial system. So as we saw earlier for the Southeastern EU, Poland, Italy, the improvement for the government welfare is much larger as there is no uncovered risk and therefore no compensation payments needed anymore. In contrast, as we saw for the Netherlands and also the Baltic states, the improvement for the private welfare is much larger than for the government welfare or public welfare. There are many details we could look into, but I also wanted to show you the implications for the public budget. So with the lower economic activity, also the tax base is reduced. This effect is particularly strong for the factor tax with less factors employed in production. And this implies that tax income for the public household decreases. And together with this decrease in income, a rise in compensation payments, as it usually is in place in voluntary systems, this intensifies the pressure on public budgets. So lower income, higher expenditures increases the pressure on public budgets. Eventually, we also looked at the overall costs of insurance market systems at the EU level. And here I just show you the different scenario combinations. And as you see, it's not a big spread. And we also see that the GDP effects are rather insensitive to changes in insurance market systems. So it's not a question of how the economy in total is affected, but more of a burden sharing question. So is it the private or the public household that bears the costs? And for both private and public welfare, both alternative insurance market systems are an improvement over the baseline systems, with private welfare tending to be least affected in the solidarity system and public welfare tending to be least affected in the public-private partnership, also driving the overall welfare effects. And to conclude, we have seen that increasing flood risk represents a challenge for economies in 2050, and the macroeconomic consequences vary with the underlying insurance market systems. A higher degree of risk sharing among different actors can reduce this overall macroeconomic costs, which has been also suggested by the literature and is also in line with the partial equilibrium analysis. We have seen that GDP losses are relatively insensitive towards the choice of insurance arrangement, but as I said, it's more a question of burden sharing, and the welfare indicators do reflect this burden sharing question. For the EU in total, the macroeconomic costs are lowest with a public-private partnership, followed by a solidarity system, and has the highest costs in the baseline scenario, so where each region maintains its current insurance market system. So no engagement in insurance activities may seem as the cheapest option in the first place for policymakers, but there are additional expenditures when households are insufficiently insured because prices of premiums are too high and the demand is low, and there is some kind of social safety net in place to prevent households from moving into poverty. And finally, our results are clearly valid from a modeling perspective. However, there are some limitations, such as we assume a frictionless move from one insurance market system to the other. There are institutional framework conditions and also questions of political feasibility. So we want to inform the debate on different approaches to climate change adaptation with a special focus on flood risk for a broad set of climate and socioeconomic scenarios. Yes, that's it. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you again, Predrag, for the interesting presentation. We had a lot of questions. I saw that while you were presenting, Nina, Predrag started to write his answer to the people who raised the question. So first, given that many of the questions that were raised to Predrag were related to the way in which the clim risk model accounts for climate change damages, because many of the questions were which kind of damages are included, how they are translated into an economic evaluation, which kind of so how a specific impact can be attributed to climate change, given that some of the impacts like floods or droughts could also become occur independently upon climate change. So just if you can very briefly recap this question, because they're very hot topic, and so many ask this. And a question for both of you, which is the usual $1 million question: how can we, or how do you include uncertainty in all these evaluation, and how this can be communicated to stakeholders? So Predrag first, and then the question on uncertainty for both.
Yes, so I've already tried writing a little bit about how the clim risk model works. Fortunately, the original clim risk paper was published I think last week or 2 weeks ago. So I can also link that where it goes into detail about how exactly these damage functions work. But very briefly, we are relying on the Rice model damage functions, which translate temperature change into direct economic damages. And this is sort of the work of William Nordhaus that he already started with the original DICE model. And this does also include sea level rise, but it is very bad at really focusing on these specific events, specific flooding or natural disasters. These extreme events are not really explicitly modeled with these simple quadratic damage functions, but the shapes of these damage functions are quadratic so as to capture the to sort of try projecting a little bit how these extreme events might really spiral out of control, but they don't really necessarily look at individual events. So this is something that we consider still a kind of a downside of ClimRisk, and something that we're looking into improving in actually in our recent work with CMCC. We're really trying to make more local damage functions and potentially in the future also account for these specific events. But I think for more information, I will also link some of the literature.
Okay, Ina, if you want to go with uncertainty, and then Predrag, and then we have a lot of questions for Nina too.
Yeah, okay. So to the uncertainty, there are many dimensions of uncertainty, and we try to cover as many as possible. So for example, we account for different climate scenarios. So this is one type of uncertainty, RCPs 2.6 to 8.5. We also use data from different global climate models, so general circulation models, which especially for precipitation, so relevant for flooding, do diverge quite a bit. So we also use data from different climate models. And then third dimension, the socioeconomic development, as socioeconomic driver is also important for flooding. We also account for this uncertainty. And then there is also the economic modeling uncertainty, where we do sensitivity analysis of all the parameters that we have in the model. And I think it's very important to communicate this. It's always a challenge to communicate this to policymakers who are not very familiar with maybe the models and also these approaches. But yeah, I would say we always try to be as clear and honest about the uncertainties as possible. And I think this is also one goal of the project in general.
Yes, Predrag, would you like, sorry, to add something on the uncertainty?
Yes, so it's kind of similar to Nina's story. It's something that we're also doing pretty well, hopefully in ClimRisk. So the goal is to have a relatively simple to run model, which can account for many different types of uncertainty. So this goes for climate uncertainty, so we can run the model for many different RCP scenarios, but also specific INDCs. So we can really account for example, what if the US does not abide by the Paris Agreement, or what if China doesn't do that? So we really try having a wide climate uncertainty range. And we also use a range of climate models based on which are local temperature patterns are modeled. Maybe it's a topic for another time, or also you can also read in the paper. And as far as the socioeconomic uncertainty, we can run our model for many different SSP scenarios. And I think there was also a question for adaptation. So that's not something that is accounted for in this baseline sort of ClimRisk model, but it is something that we're actively working on with our ClimRisk extensions, which relate to river flooding. For example, we can account for different kinds of river flooding adaptations. So, for example, if the adaptation is done in an economically optimal way, or if it's kept at the exact same level, we can account for this type of adaptation. And same goes for heat adaptation, which is our most recent work with ClimRisk. We can also account for different levels of adaptations to heat. So yeah, this is also something we're trying to communicate in our work, but it's of course a bit difficult to decide what scenarios specifically the policymakers are interested in, and yeah, how to really present this in a very effective way. So maybe if someone has an idea, it can also be shared.
Okay, and now Nina, up to you, because we have many questions also on the insurance presentation. So let me try to summarize a little bit, because try to compact them. First of all, something that I note also is that it seems to me that there is not that huge differences across the different schemes, insurance schemes, in the sense that yes, indeed, welfare and cost are changing, but I mean, we are within the 1 to 3% compared to the base case. So one question is perhaps here we have some issues of scale, because insurance is very local. When you work at NUTS 2 or a larger level, then something could I mean, this averaging effect could hide some larger differences. So what do you think about this? And another question on insurance is if these three different approaches to insurance that you are modeling are providing, or can you tell something about how they provide different incentives to prevent the damage? Because someone from our audience says that perhaps there could be also some perverse incentive to take less precautionary attitudes or behavior because there is insurance. So do you see with your study and your results some differences in providing the correct incentives to the insured to take also precautionary measures, or not?
Okay, yeah, thank you for the questions. So to the first, about this aggregating effect, this is very true. So if we think of our scale, we look at regions, sometimes it's countries, sometimes it's also 2 or 3 countries aggregated, and we only consider flood risk in 100-year floodplains. So for those households that are most at risk from flooding. So clearly these impacts that we kind of put into the model are rather small. So we do have flood impacts that are depend on the size of the economy, but then the changes in the insurance parameters, so changes of the size of the premiums and compensation payments, these are rather small. So that's why also the macroeconomic outcomes are rather small. Still, we think we do see differences that are in line with the literature. So and also given the scenario combination set, we do see these differences. So it's not a random result in that respect. Also, with respect to this question, we look at expected annual damages. So if we would look at like a 100-year event, this results would also change very much, because in the expected annual damage case, the insurances always cover all their expenditures, right? So the premiums always make up for all the damages. So this would also change very much if we consider a larger event, for example. And then with respect to the incentives, this is probably more a question to those who did the DeFi modeling. But what I can say is that some systems do provide incentives for adaptation. So for example, if we think of the solidarity system, where each household pays the same no matter its personal risk, and also no matter what it does, there is no incentive to actually undertake adaptation measures. Whereas in other insurance market systems, this element can be implemented. So premiums can be lower for those households that undertake adaptation actions, such as wet flood proofing or dry flood proofing, like moving your stuff from the basement to the first floor and so on. But in general, yes, this principal agent issue is very relevant in insurance discussions, also with respect to the public household. So if the public household is not the one covering uncovered risk, it might be reluctant to undertake public adaptation measures, such as construction walls. And yeah, thank you.
Okay, just another question for the both of you. I see that Predrag is writing is a compulsive answer to to our audience. Just a general question that can be addressed to both studies. So of course we are taking and we are trying to project or to find insights in sometimes a far distant future. So how are we taking into account the evolution of societies? Also, for instance, for the possibility to pay insurance and how to consider if there is some autonomous adaptation in our scenarios, and eventually if we are using some discount rates. So how do we consider the intertemporal dimension? So this is a question that can be raised to both studies, just to give an idea to our audience. And this will be also the last question, because we have 3 minutes to go. Who wants to start first? Nina, please.
So for our model, for our economic model, I should add it's a static model. So what we look at is 2 different states in 2050. So these developments towards 2050, towards the future, are based on exogenous parameters. So on the literature, as to how CO2 prices are going to be, for example, GDP in the different regions, population, and so on. And then we construct an economy in 2050, which we then shock, so to say, with the flooding and the insurance parameters. So we only look at the changes between these 2 potential states in the future, and clearly there could be a better way to represent the future, but we are very limited in that respect to available data.
Thank you, Nina. Predrag, 1 minute.
Yeah, so with regards to adaptation, I have to say we're quite we're still not that prepared to account for it, especially the autonomous adaptation. The claim risk is a model that although it does try to project damages on a very local scale, it does so in a very kind of a brute force manner, and we're trying to really work on this to really expand on and really use the local scale adaptation. But this is still something that we would need to potentially team up with other people who know a little bit more about this than we do. If you have ideas, maybe we can have a separate discussion. I think Jakub had the question. And with regards to the discount rates, that was another question. We're very flexible in the discount rate which we were using, but up until now, that the discount rate has mainly been used as either as for kind of sensitivity analysis and also for presentation purposes. So if we would like to present results for, let's say, the 21st century, then we would choose to use discounted values. But this is not something we've gone into detail about. Indeed, what is the most appropriate discount value to use? So
okay.
that's it briefly.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can conclude here. Let me just recall to our audience. Unfortunately, it will be an Italian, but the next webinar on July 21st at 12, focusing on glaciology and impacts on the ice sheet, basically start in the cryosphere. Okay, it will be the translation and the communication in Italian of the IPCC report on this specific topic. So thanking everyone who was and is still with us. I also let me thank again our speakers for the very interesting presentation, and see you soon. I think that we are going to have other coach webinars, but more in the future, so after the summer break. Okay, thank you very much again, and see you soon. Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.